Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Happy New Year. I'm Bailey Mizell, the Director of Photographic Arts Council Los Angeles, and we're excited to be joined today by multimedia artist and educator Andrea Chung. She'll be walking us through her ongoing image and research-based photographic practice, early works, and her examination of subjects in materiality, kinship, and identity, and labor and post-colonialism. Before we get into it, I'd like to start by giving a note of gratitude to our board of directors and our membership base for your ongoing support and commitment to PAC LA's growth, our programming, and building our community, making events like today and future ones possible for the LA arts community and our members. I'll just give you a quick run of show before I introduce Andrea, and then we'll get started. Andrea will present to us and give an artist talk for about 40 to 45 minutes. And then following that, I will come back to moderate an open conversation and Q&A with Andrea and the audience. If at any point you have any questions or comments for Andrea, please do feel free to add them to the chat in the Q&A box during the presentation. And Andrea's asked also that we answer some of the questions and bring them up during the talk and presentation. So please do feel free to add them as they come to you. Now I'm going to introduce Andrea, and then we'll get started. Andrea lives and works in San Diego, California. She received a Bachelor of Fine Arts from Parsons School of Design, New York, and a Master of Fine Arts from Maryland Institute College of Art, Baltimore. Her recent biennial and museum exhibitions include Prospect 4, New Orleans, and the Jamaican Biennial, Kingston, Jamaica, as well as the Chinese American Museum and California African American Museum in Los Angeles, and the San Diego Art Institute. In 2017, her first solo museum exhibition, You Broke the Ocean in Half to Be Here, took place at the Museum of Contemporary Art, San Diego. She has participated in national and international residencies, including the Vermont Studio Center, McColl Center for Visual Arts, Headlands Center for the Arts, and Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture. Her work has been written about in Artfile Magazine, New Orleans Times, Picayune, Artnet, the Los Angeles Times, and International Review of African American Art, among others. Her work is included in collections such as the Museum of Contemporary Art San Diego, Rhode Island School of Design Museum, NoVo Foundation, Cleveland Clinic Art and Medicine Institute, Minneapolis Institute of Art, Davis Museum at Wesley College, Addison Museum of American Art, and the J. Paul Getty Museum. Again, I will return at the end to moderate the Q&A, but please do add your questions and comments in the chat for Andrea. And I will pass it to you now, Andrea. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it. Let me go to share screen. Please feel free to ask questions during the lecture. I'm pretty informal, so I like sort of hearing people have questions and answering them immediately. Right. Here we go. Okay. So I guess I'll start. These are some of my earliest works from grad school. I initially started off as a painter, and I do not paint anymore. I sort of feel a little disillusioned by having been sort of force-fed the history of painting from a very Eurocentric perspective. So I felt like it didn't really, it didn't have the language that I needed in order to sort of talk about the things that interest me. And I was thinking a lot about my family and how they found their way into the Caribbean. So rather than painting, I started looking at objects that sort of changed the face of the Caribbean. So for Jamaica and Trinidad in particular, sugar was the main exported item, and how something so mundane, something that we take for granted, could really alter the landscape of a place. So initially I'd started doing paintings of my family. And if you've ever been in grad school, it's really hard to take a critique on your grandmother. So I started looking at alternative images and looking more generally in archives. So I wanted to find images of slavery within the Caribbean, only to find out that there are none that actually exist in the Caribbean, because the invention of photography actually came after the abolishment of slavery in the British colonies. So I started noticing that a lot of the images that were used to describe slavery or to illustrate slavery in the Caribbean were images like this, which is actually a posed image that came after slavery was abolished. And these images were all posed so that once the sugar economy had collapsed on the islands, they decided that tourism was the best way to get visitors onto the island. And these were directed to white foreign visitors, so people from the US, people from Europe, to come into the island. And oftentimes in these images, you will see that the Black figures are in subservient positions, laying down, sitting down, bending over. So I knew that I could not erase the past, but I could, I wanted to find a way to honor their labor. So the best way to do it was to give them a day off. So this series is called May Day, which is sort of a play on the holiday, the workers' holiday, and also the distress signal. So this is the first image. The man on the left is on the, the right is actually the photographer Dupperly, who, if you ever see any of these archive images of Jamaica or Barbados in particular, they were often taken by him and his son. So this is an install shot from my show at the Museum of Contemporary Art, San Diego. Again, sort of just playing with the idea of having the viewer sort of question who was there, why they were there. Also in Jamaica, we refer to ghosts as duppies. And I kind of see these figures as being duppies, as when you see them against the wall, they, as in the first one, they start to cast these shadows. And then from there, I started looking at more recent current images of tourism. So this is from a series of travel magazines called Caribbean Life and Travel. It's now defunct, but it was, like, I think it lasted for about 30 years. And I found a collection of them on eBay. And I noticed that, again, the Black figure was in a subservient position. So this is a Black butler that I've excised out of the image. And again, serving a white audience, making it seem as though it's orderly and safe, very manicured. And I found this throughout quite a few images. So I'll move to the next one. And this is an animation that I did based on a tourism commercial that's really famous. The slogan, "Come Back to Jamaica," is one that I knew as a child. It was the slogan by the tourism board for at least 20 years. So again, I'm removing the figures, but this time animating it. So I will play this video. You guys let me know if you can't hear the sound, but it should work. Oops.
Come back to Jamaica.
Come back to gentility.
What's old is what's new.
Come back to our beauty.
We want you to join us.
Come back to our people.
We made it for you.
Come back to hospitality.
So make it Jamaica.
Come back to our bounty.
Make it your own.
Come back to tranquility.
Make it Jamaica.
Come back to romance.
Your new island home.
Come back to the way things used to be. Make it Jamaica again, and make it your own.
Make it Jamaica, your new island home.
All right. Again, this commercial actually came out the year I was born in 1978. And again, something that always sort of stuck in my mind. It's interesting that this commercial had every single stereotype that you could possibly think of. There's the exotic beauty, there's the laborer, the figure right now is the Uncle Remus figure. And you also have the market woman, which is a continued stereotype that you often see in advertisements for the Caribbean, and really wanting to question, why is it that places with Black and brown people are sold in this fashion? Why is it the exotic beauty? Why is it something hypersexualized? why is it asking you to come back to the way things used to be? Basically come back to when we were slaves, when things were genteel, and not really asking you to enjoy the country for what it is, for its culture, for the land. It's very much sort of encouraging the behavior that I tend to see when I do go back to Jamaica, of people coming there to just smoke weed or behaving in ways they wouldn't at home. And I think a lot of times people forget that when you do go to another country, you are a guest and you should behave as such. And you don't see these kinds of advertisements for places like Germany or Norway or England. It's very much, looking at the Queen or their cuisine, things like that. And I just find it interesting, and I really want people to question these images that they're seeing and why they're dispersed the way they are. So I went back to Jamaica with my family, I want to say maybe 2012. And the first time I went to Jamaica, I was 13. And there were these sculptures that you would find all over the craft markets that were geared towards tourists. And these were one of the sculptures that was there. There's also some that are of a Rasta that is wearing a barrel around his waist. And when you pick up the barrel, his penis is on a spring and it actually bounces up and down. There are also versions of this that are actually life-size that you would see on the side of the road while you were driving through the country to get to places like Ocho Rios or Negril. And I remembered this as a child. And when we went back to Jamaica, I intentionally went to the craft markets to find these, and it was very easy to find. I interviewed a lot of the vendors as to how they felt about selling it. And they told me that they wouldn't sell things that the tourism board wouldn't approve. So clearly there is, marketing that's geared towards sex tourism, which is a problem when you look at the HIV rates that are happening in places like Jamaica that don't necessarily have adequate healthcare to provide for everyone, especially those in rural areas and in shanty towns. So I think that, I really want to talk about sort of the exploitation of the Black body, not just women, but also how men are exploited. There's a concept there called rent-a-dread, where white foreign women will come and find a boyfriend for the duration of the time that they're there, not really considering the implications of that. So for this exhibition, I cast the figures out of sugar and let them melt for the duration of the exhibition. So these are just some stills. That's a still of it. I'm kind of moving through these quickly because I tend to take too long discussing the work. This is a piece that I created as a result of my time as a Fulbright scholar in Mauritius. I went there to study the cuisine as a way to talk about migration patterns into the country. Mauritius has a very similar history to the Caribbean. It's a former sugar colony. It was colonized by the Dutch, the French, the British. And I was in particular interested in this one village in the southern part of Mauritius called Le Morne. And the history of Le Morne is that there's a mountain in Le Morne that marooned slaves would, they escaped and they would establish a village on top of that mountain. And it was a very strategic place because it was very difficult to scale. And once they had established this village, they went back to their mother tongues. They did, they ate the foods that they, that were, common to them. They practiced their religions. And when the British abolished slavery, they sent troops to let them know that they were free, but also to recapture some of them. And they collectively, as a group, jumped off the cliff of the mountain rather than go back to being enslaved. And after slavery was abolished, the former enslaved people were supposed to be to do a 7-year apprenticeship on the plantations in order to help those plantation owners who were in dire straits now to the collapse of the sugar economy. And rather than do that, they took on fishing as a trade. So it became a generational trade that was passed down. the people that are the descendants of slaves are referred to as Creoles, and they're treated just as poorly as Black folks are here, referred to as being lazy and savage, primitive. And I thought it was really interesting because they took this trade on as a revolutionary act of, no, I'm not going to work on your plantation to ease your suffering. I'm going to do something for myself and my family. I'm going to find my own way. And I really, I really respect that in a lot of ways. And while I was there, my husband fished with a lot of Mauritians, and they used bottles rather than fishing rods. So I decided to cast these bottles out of sugar. And for the duration of the exhibition, they would slowly melt and sort of morph. And their fishing trade is starting to sort of die out now because there's a lot of foreign vessels coming into their waters. So this was a really great exhibition to sort of play with because I had a thermostat in the studio. This is at the McColl Center, so I could sort of heat up the space. I could sort of control how quickly or how slowly the bottles would melt over time. And when I initially installed this, none of the bottles were broken. Someone actually got caught onto a hook and brought half of the installation down. And I was horrified at first, but then I was like, it kind of works. It kind of goes with the subject matter of the piece. So now every time I install it, I make sure that it's somewhat destroyed and that it's always going to look different despite the space, despite the conditions of the room. And I think this sort of started my love for the ephemeral. Everybody always wants to commodify this piece, and they ask me how do you sell it? And my attitude is I don't. It doesn't need to be sold. Why do you feel the need to sort of commodify this very tragic story? And it's in some ways a little bit of my middle finger to the art world of always wanting to commodify these stories of Black trauma. So this is another close-up. And this is a really fun piece. Every time I install it, I just really enjoy working on it. And it never looks the same. So there's fishing tackle on there as well. They often used nuts and bolts as weights. So I attached those to the pieces as well. So I did a research project with a professor from Pitzer College. Her research was focused on Black midwives from the South and looking at the medicalization of childbirth. Black midwives who were, quote unquote, untrained, were usually older Black women that felt they had a calling from God. And they serviced women in rural areas that didn't have access to proper health care. Midwives also existed on plantations as well, and not only took care of mothers and pregnant women, but also functioned as like doctors for enslaved peoples. They also birthed the slave masters' children and also provided abortions for women, which is kind of leading into the work that I'm doing now. So we decided to go to Jamaica and to do a comparative study to see how similar or dissimilar the practices were. And we found that it was extremely similar. And there were a lot of African retentions between the two locations. One practice is that you would put something sharp under the bed, like a pair of scissors or an axe, and that was to cut the labor pains of the mother. Another is like they were able to identify a lot of medicinal teas. When enslaved women came from Africa into the quote unquote new world, they had an amazing knowledge of plants that was incredibly impressive to even Europeans. While they were still bloodletting, these women knew how to heal. So that was a tradition that has been passed down and you still continue to see in both locations. So these hands are in the position of catching. In the South, catching babies is the term that's used for delivering babies. And I cast the hands in pulp that's made from birthing cloths in a mixture of red raspberry tea. So as we're making it, you can sort of smell the tea. And this is also another medicinal herb that was used by midwives. I think this is marigold, can't remember. And midwives still exist in Jamaica. They're referred to as Nana midwives, again, older women. And the practice of obstetrics became medicalized by white male doctors. In the US, they actually trained with Black midwives and then banned them from practicing. So they had to become certified and pass all these cleanliness tests because they thought of them as being dirty. And modern day obstetrics is basically, the foundation of it is everything those white doctors learned from those Black midwives. So in Jamaica, you can still have a Nana midwife deliver your children, but you kind of have to know someone who knows someone. And I thought that it was really interesting thinking about like the hiddenness of these women, that you generally have to go into the country to find somebody who still practices in this way. So I embossed the various medicinal herbs onto the paper that is also made out of birthing cloth. And I have it on a kind of like an X-ray box, like a lit box that it pulses kind of like your breath. And then it slowly reveals the midwives underneath the paper. And this is a piece called Pure. It's still based on the midwives' research. I installed this at the Jamaican Biennale. This is at Devon House, which was the first Black millionaire in Jamaica. It's in Kingston. A funny story about this piece is that I had a table that was slightly smaller than this that I planned to take. And when I got to the airport, I was not allowed to take any boxes on the plane. So I had to just sort of pack the hands, all these soap hands in my suitcase. And just as soon as I got to Jamaica, I had to go to the store and just buy things and sort of recreate this installation, which ended up being a lot of fun for me because it gave me a love for working site specifically now. And I like the idea of having to work around the space as opposed to this already identified piece that's just going to neatly fit in a space. So this is a bathroom in Devon House. And I was fascinated with the idea of people thinking that these midwives were dirty. So I cast their hands out of soap. It's made out of shea butter and black soap. And not in this iteration because it's a historical landmark, but I have it up currently at the Cleveland Museum. The viewer is actually able to wash their hands with the hands of the midwife if they choose to. And I decided to create these sort of like interventions. This is the bedroom that's connected to the bathroom. Really interested in the retentions that I saw in Jamaica as well. Yemiya is the Orisha of motherhood and a protector of women. So I made an altarpiece to her. Everything that you see was originally there with the exception of the beads and the coins and the coconut. It just seemed like an appropriate way to sort of pay homage to Yemiya. And another practice that we have in Jamaica is that when a child is born, after you cut the navel string, which is the umbilical cord, you bury it with a fruit plant. So in the basin, you have a pair of hands and the navel string is connected to a naceberry seed, which is a fruit in Jamaica. And it's connected underneath the bed to a pair of scissors. And what you're supposed to do is once you cut the navel string, you take the fruit and you bury it into the ground. And for the rest of your life, you're supposed to nurture that plant. And it's a way of connecting you to home. Okay, breeze through these. I kind of jump around to different materials that interest me. And this is kind of going back to thinking about the history of photography in relation to the Caribbean. And actually, Harold Mendez taught me how to make a cyanotype. We were at a residency together at the Headlands, and he just really felt that this was a medium that would work for some of the ideas I'd been thinking about. So I was really interested in particularly cyanotypes. I learned about it when I was really young and I worked at the Getty, and I knew that it was used to capture the natural world. I learned about Anna Atkins when I was working there. And I had also been collecting these weird stories about lionfish that were invading the Caribbean, and they destroy everything. There's no natural predator, so they're sort of just going and eating everything. They're usually around 9 pounds, but they're starting to find lionfish that are now getting up to almost 20 pounds. And they're also, they're starting to see lionfish that they cut open that have lots of fat all over their bodies because they're just eating and eating. And the only predator there is for us to eat them. So there's a huge movement now to do your civic duty and eat a lionfish. The other thing that I thought was interesting is that the language that's used when talking about lionfish and their, quote unquote invasion is very similar to the way that people talk about immigrants coming into the country. Very violent, and they didn't just naturally swim here. They're native. Sorry. They're not native to this side of the world. They're actually from the Indian Ocean. So they were brought here during the aquarium trade. And that's why I think that the language that's used to describe them is rather fascinating, because they weren't brought here on their own volition. They were, brought here for someone's amusement. And I thought that they would be a really great metaphor to talk about colonialism, that they're invading this space and sort of taking over and destroying what was originally there. And they have a really voracious appetite. They're also stunningly beautiful fish. If you've ever seen one in person, it's kind of like watching their fins move sort of like angel wings. And they have a really seductive quality to them, but they're highly poisonous and venomous. And if you were to get pricked by their spines, you would have to go to the hospital immediately because you could actually die. I was also fascinated with the history of cyanotypes and how not only were they used to capture the natural world, but they were also used to make blueprints before the invention of like the Xerox machine and carbon paper. And that really made me think a lot about the planning that went into colonialism. And doing a lot of this work, I was finding a lot of plans for how to build a slave ship. I found blueprints for building the slave castle on Goree Island. And I'm really, I guess, interested in the effort that goes into colonizing and imperialism, that someone really sat there and took the time to figure out how they could fit X amount of bodies on a slave ship. It's rather psychotic, but there is a lot of effort that has gone into that planning. It's something that I like to examine. So in this image, I have, again, more cyanotypes of two different kinds of lionfish that are attacking each other. One is in a military formation and the other is a little more sort of guerrilla tactic. And you can't really discern that they're different kinds of lionfish. And I see these as sort of like the many colonizers that sort of came in and invaded the land. You can't really identify whom is who. No one was better than the other. The French were no better than the British, that were no better than the Dutch, and so on. So I sort of like to discuss that in this piece.
Andrea,
yeah,
it's Lily here. Can you talk a little bit about the binding of the grid?
Yes, nothing particularly special about it. It's really just linen tape.
Okay.
And a lack of having the space of making these on one sheet. I made these all in my my house. One of the things that I do is when I'm learning when I want to make a new piece, I try to learn a new skill. So I learned how to make cyanotypes, and I had to build myself a dark room in a half bathroom that I have in my house. So, this is maybe 200 prints, and I'm coating the paper on my toilet on a piece of cardboard, putting it in the shower to dry, printing it on my porch, and then going in my backyard with the kiddie pool and washing everything out. So it's a lack of having the resources to do this in a photo lab, and you know, just adhering everything together. I'm very much a DIY type of artist. I don't like super slick work. I like that you can see the hand in the work. I like the imperfections in work. I like failure a lot. I don't like it in the moment, but I learned so much from failing. And I think this piece in particular is a prime example of that. If you can look at the orange that's in the top right hand, that actually was not intentional. That was my dog stepping on my work while it was still wet. And he had, I don't know how or why, but he had baking soda on his foot and stepped on the piece, and I was horrified. But then I was like, oh, that's really cool. Like, I didn't know that I could get that color playing with the cyanotypes. So it was something that I learned from this. If you see some of the speckling, it's me throwing salt on the paper while the chemical is still wet. You get like a speckling almost. It's sort of like gives you the feel of being underwater, but also celestial, which I really love. Spraying water on the paper. I don't want it to match perfectly together. You'll never get the same tone of blue, no matter how hard you try. And I have tried. So you kind of have to live and let the material do what it's going to do and give up control. And I think that's something that I learned with the sugar, and something that cyanotypes constantly teach me over and over again, is that you have to give up control and allow the material to have its own life. And again, it's still an ephemeral material, because if this was exposed directly into the sun over the course of time, it'll turn white. But then if you bring it back into a dark space, the color will come back. And I'm really interested in that. This piece is Sea Change. It's the lionfish morphing into sargassum seaweed, which is another invasive species, and sort of thinking about what happens when you move people from one location to the next. They become something else. They're no longer what they once were. So that's what that's why I have the fish sort of transforming, and the space is darkly lit, and you're supposed to sort of feel enveloped like you're underwater. It's 4 different walls. I think the space was a little less than 1,000 square feet. Okay, this is a video piece I showed at the Perez. This is just a detail of it. I'll go to the video.
Love After Love by Derek Walcott. The time will come when, with elation, you will greet yourself arriving at your own door, in your own mirror, and each will smile at the other's welcome and say, sit here, eat. You will love again the stranger who was yourself.
The time will come when, with elation,
give wine, give bread,
greet yourself
give back your heart to itself,
in your
to the stranger who has loved you.
And each will smile at the
The
others
time
all
will
your
come
life
when
and say,
who you ignored
with
for
elation,
another,
eat.
who knows
You
you
will
by
greet yourself
heart,
arriving
you will love
at
again
your
the
own
stranger.
door.
Take down the love
yourself
letters
in
from
your
the
own
bookshelf,
Give
and
wine,
each will
give
smile
bread,
the photographs,
welcome.
the
Give back
desperate
your
notes,
heart to
and
itself,
say, peel
to
your
the
own
stranger who
image
has
from
loved
the
you
mirror.
all your
Eat.
life, whom you ignored for
You will love
another,
again the stranger who was
who knows
yourself.
you by heart. Take down the
Give
love letters from
wine,
the
give
bookshelf,
bread, give back your heart
the
to itself,
photographs, the desperate notes,
to the stranger who
peel
has
your
loved
own
you
image from the mirror.
all your life, whom you ignored for another, who knows you by heart. Take down the love letters from the bookshelf, the photographs, the desperate notes. Peel your own image from the mirror. Sit. Feast on your life.
Okay, so this piece is called An Unrequited Love. The narrator is an amazing performance artist, Jody Lin Ki Chow, also Chinese Jamaican. And if you've ever heard one of my lectures before, I've spoken about it before, that I'm estranged from my father. He's not happy that I'm an artist. And I think that I'm very fascinated in the psychological effects of colonialism on the family structure. I haven't spoken to my father in 8 years now. He does not know my child. And it was a very heartbreaking situation for me. That's still hard. But it made me think a lot about how, oftentimes England is referred to as the mother country to all of these now independent countries, and how no matter what you do to sort of assimilate, the mother country will never accept you. So I have these barrister wigs that, sort of exemplify Britishness, and I'm trying to undo the wigs and lock them, but I'm failing at dreadlocking them. So the piece, the poem is by Derek Walcott, and it discusses, after the breakup of a relationship, of learning to love and accept yourself as you are. And so often I see, when I go back to the Caribbean, I see this idea that your closeness to Britishness will give you acceptance, and that's not at all true. You're still an outsider. And I think the Windrush situation that happened, that's continually happening right now in England, is a prime example of that. Almost done. Okay, this was a really fun exhibition that I was a part of at MOAD in San Francisco. The show was called Rum, Coffee, Sugar, Gold. It was looking at the exported items that sort of made what happened as far as like having colonization happening in the Caribbean, all of the items that were a product of it. So originally I was really fascinated with the phrase, "I swear on a stack of Bibles." And the intention was to cast as many sugar Bibles as I could and stack them in these like ridiculous forms. But again, getting there, and the first place I was put in had no stove, so I couldn't cook, and I had to go to the curator's apartment and spilled sugar all over her kitchen, and then eventually found a place that I could cook. So I just sort of had to make do with the situation and the site, and it ended up being one of the most fun projects I've ever done. I walked around the city and found hymnals, and as I went to MOAD to sort of put some of the Bibles on the plinth to see how many left I needed to cast, I felt like it looked like evidence, which works ideally with the concept as well. So I kind of ran with that and started playing with inserting some of the hymnals and thinking a lot about Black Americans' relationship to Christianity, how it was something that was used to justify enslaving people, but also as a way to sort of support the civil rights movement. The church was a huge part of the civil rights movement, and the complications, also how religion has been used to sort of, has been twisted to support homophobia, how it's supposed to be a separation of church and state, and yet it's not, which is why the gavel is there. And then I started thinking about all of the things that come along when you're moving these folks, and I wanted to sort of embed some of the beads that represented the very orishas that that people would sort of hide into Catholicism. They would pray to a saint, but they were actually maybe praying to Yemiya or Oshun or Legba. So I sort of incorporated those things in there. And then the hymnal that you see is Amazing Grace, which is a huge part of the Black church. Also infusing rice that women would hide in their hairs as they went to Brazil as a way to sort of have a piece of home. So I wanted to sort of talk about the complication and also just experiment with the sugar. This is the first time I really sort of started imbuing things within the sugar. The darkest Bibles was the burnt sugar that was me cooking in the curator's apartment. I just sort of like went along with whatever mistakes happened and just played with it. And it just ended up being a lot of fun. I think this is about 100 pounds of sugar. And I could have kept going if it weren't for, limited time, but it was a really fun project for me to do. This is a image from a solo show I had at Cloughton Man. Again, this time I decided to sort of combine the sugar with the cyanotypes, looking at corals and thinking about coral bleaching, and also thinking about how like corals are their own colonies. And if you give them time, if you leave them alone, they can sort of regenerate on their own. So I was thinking a lot about that. So for this, I decided to immerse the cyanotypes in sugar, and then we hung them up wet. So over the duration of the exhibition, the sugar would start to sort of chip and fall and crystallize on its own. This is an install shot. And I really love the way that Tyler and Deb and I decided to sort of frame these, is that they're inside of their own sort of shadow box now with the collection of sugar. And it's like a living piece because the sugar will continually fall. It's a living thing. It has its own history. And that's how I sort of approach all my work. So this is a piece called The Litany for Survival. It's currently up at the AGO in Toronto. I decided to sort of like limit painting the sugar on this one. So it's just on aspects of the coral. This is a detail. Wrapping it up, this is an installation that I did at the Addison Museum. It is a planetarium that is inspired by their maps collection. I had time to sort of study the maps with the librarian there and was really interested in the goofy looking sea monsters that were on the maps. Some of them were like really ridiculous because these Europeans had never seen a whale before. So you have these crazy looking creatures, or they would draw images of primitives that were like, they had like arms and legs on a spit. And oftentimes these drawings, as ridiculous as they were used as warning signals for different navigators that were coming through. So it might indicate that there were dangerous waters, or that you need to still watch out for the natives that were in that particular land. And I thought they were so stupid and ridiculous and funny. And then I thought, well, we didn't have any warning about what was going to happen. And what would that look like? What would it look like if we had known that Europeans were going to come and colonize us and enslave us? So I decided to sort of create that. So this planetarium projects the westerlies, which were the trade winds that actually allowed slave ships to move to the New World. Without those trade winds, without those currents, they would have never been able to make those trips, not in the time that they did. So for this installation, I have a meeting of the sky and the sea. It's all cyanotypes. The fabric is all cyanotypes. And then I used plexi to sort of create this feeling of water. And I have let me exit out of this, a little video that talks a little bit about it. Sorry, I don't know why this chicken is on here. This gives you a bit more detail to it. Unfortunately, this opened during COVID, so I have not experienced the piece myself.
Sharing the gallery is the monumental installation titled The Westerlies, Prevailing the Winds, which is an immersive planetarium shrouded in cyanotyped canvas and depicting the night sky. The work was created by artist Andrea Chung and inspired by star charts in the Knaufel map collection, with their images also of sea monsters and other chimerical beings. Chung inverts the assumptions of this type of map with this piece, which is a work that speculates on the navigation and forecasting techniques of Indigenous peoples in zones of discovery. The fictitious animals and human beings with exaggerated attributes depicted on these early maps reveal historic perceptions about the oceans, lands, and their inhabitants, and often served as cautions to European explorers and colonists. Building on this in her work generally, which is an incisive focus on island nations in the Caribbean Sea and the Indian Ocean, Chung imagines a context in which their people might receive warnings from the sea and sky of imminent colonial danger. In the westerlies prevailing the winds, threats of violent invasion are written in water and sky. When the viewer steps into the dome, they are immersed in aqueous blue light, and they are invited to experience the ocean and heavens as expanse and enclosure, to feel themselves, like the early seafarers, suspended between the two, and invite them to mine both the realms for omens. Included in this work is the haunting voice of the artist's son, who whispers to viewers as they begin their journey.
When I saw the map collection, I was really interested in the drawings. All right, you don't need to hear me talk. So yeah, unfortunately, I was never really able to experience that piece, which was disappointing because I spent 2 years working with them for that. And the sound that you hear is my son, who makes you feel like you're looking at the night sky, and he's saying, "What's that over there? Who's that?" And he's sort of like whispering as he's talking. And that was sort of based off of a study that I'd found about cosmologies. And in Africa at one point, they'd seen Orion sort of flutter and flitter in the sky, and they thought it was like imminent danger. And I thought that was a really interesting way of sort of reading that. So I kind of took that and sort of ran with it. And that was sort of the inspiration for the piece. Sorry. There we go. All right, there we go. So these are small collages that I started in 2018. Actually, I was just doing it as I was kind of stuck on an idea, and my husband sort of suggested that I make small collages because they seem to sort of like help me get my brain going, and sort of like, it's kind of like the practice that people have of drawing in their studio every day. For me, it was just making a bunch of collages. And they were sort of in response to a lot of the midwife research that I had been doing. I was really interested in sort of paying tribute to these oriches. So blue and greens and silvers are usually attributed to Yemaya, and yellows are Oshun's color. So everything that you see here, the fruit, the flowers, they are very specific to those orishas. And it was sort of my offering to them for the work that I had done. So in these, I started sort of incorporating beads, which I'd never really worked with before, but just felt really gravitated to. Again, playing with, this series is called Sisters of Two Waters. Oshun is always connected to rivers, and Yemaya is connected to the sea, in the sense that Poseidon would be connected to the sea. She's often depicted sometimes as a mermaid. So in this, again, I'm just sort of playing with this handmade paper that I made, and sort of hiding them, and sort of playing around with the beads. And a lot of the images that I work with are ethnographic photos from vis-a-vis postcards that were created by a lot of European photographers, and that were dispersed throughout the world. I noticed that a lot of the women looked really pissed off in the photos, and I thought that there was something really funny about the fact that this photographer didn't bother to ask how they felt about their image being reproduced, and had these women known how their images would be used to further stereotype Black African women as being savage and primitive, and also as a way to sort of examine their bodies as being animal-like, thinking about like the Venus Hottentot, I don't think these women would have posed. So I sort of wanted to respond to that. So I found all the images of women that looked angry, which there were quite a few. And I thought about ninkisis, which are African fetishes that you drive a nail into, and the more nails that are driven into it is the more powerful the nkisi becomes. And I decided to turn them into nkisis, and I decided to like allow them to have the power of whether or not people could see them, get close to them. So I used needles as the nails and beaded it in the colors of those orishas. And I like these because they're 16 by 20, small, very intimate. And as a viewer, you can get close to it, but not too close because you'll get pricked by the needles. And I like the giving the women back their agency of their own bodies and their own images, and that you are not allowed to gaze on them without their permission or without getting hurt. So this series is called Vex, which is a very common way of calling someone angry in the Caribbean. And I think it just adequately went with the expressions on their faces. Some of these images are of young girls that no one had any business taking pictures of. Some of these girls are very young, they're pubescent. I am shocked that these images would be distributed as postcards the way that they were. And also thinking a lot about how nudity has been a way to sort of shame us for things that you shouldn't be gazing upon these young girls in the first place. So, you know, why should they feel shame when you're the one that's photographing them? And also thinking about the role that the photographer plays. They're not innocent. You know, they play an active role in this as well. And from there, I was also thinking about, I think I just have a soft spot as a mother. I have a soft spot for issues that deal with motherhood, and thinking a lot about how Black women's breast milk has been stripped away or used and abused by white women. And I had been doing a project in Nashville with the health department, and a woman there told me that she'd worked in New Orleans, and she was working at a hospital that is now shut down, I think as a result of Katrina. And it was a very open secret that when the Black mothers had their babies, the nurses would have them express their milk, and they would give the milk to white mothers. And then they would then give the Black mothers a medicine that would then dry up their breast milk. And it's not such a far-fetched thing. Black women have been used as wet nurses for a very long time. And up to maybe like, I wanna say maybe 5 years ago, there was a situation in Detroit where a milk bank was trying to get low-income women in Detroit to give their breast milk to them so that they could provide healthy breast milk for white mothers. And I feel like, oh my God, we're born with this, and we can't even keep it to nourish our own children. So this series is sort of inspired by that. It's called colostrum, which is the first milk that you produce as a mother. This is the end. So this is the last show that I had most recently with Tyler. It's called We Were Girls Together. I decided to sort of make collages that focused on the friendships of Black women, and thinking a lot about how if it were not for Black women, I would not have the career that I have. I would not be in the place that I am right now. I have had so many Black female curators support my career and put me in things and really support each other. And we do it because we have to. We do it because if we don't, no one will. So this was dedicated to all of the Black women that have been supportive to make me be as successful as I am. So it's a series of, I think it's 8 pieces. One's a diptych of just showing like intimacy between Black women. And, you know, the complications, like we don't always get along, but we know that we have to look out for each other no matter what. Even if you don't like each other, you do it because you cannot, you just can't. You can't do that. You have to look out for each other because no one else will. So this is a detail. These are all, again, beads, collage on handmade paper, birthing cloth again. And I had written something that went along with it, but I'm not sure I brought it up this time. And these are 30 by 50. This is probably the largest, these are the largest collages that I've worked on. And it was really inspired by Toni Morrison's Sula. So I'll read what I wrote. Sorry, let me put this back on. Oh, I don't know what that is. Sorry about this. I'll just read it from here. So I have to the Black women who are dismissed and appropriated at the same damn time. To the Black women who tell you to be loud. To the Black women who are loud. To the Black women who are made to compete with each other because someone says there can only be one. To the Black women who know your success is their success too. To the Black women who hype the shit out of you, even if they don't know you. To the Black women who are the mentors that they wish they'd had. To the Black women who check you when you need checking, but also when you don't need to be. To the Black women you only know for a reason or a season, but for meaningful relationships anyway. To the Black women who mind their own goddamn business and yours too. To the Black women whose friendships didn't work out, but we tried. To the Black women who make their own families. To the Black women who know it's hard enough to make friendships as adults without all the rest of this bullshit on top of it. To the Black women who don't own the world repair. To the Black women, and all Black women means all Black women. That is it.
Andrea, thank you. What a wonderful presentation. And you were like really thorough. I had many points I was interested in and topics and thoughts, and you just knocked them all out. So I do have a question here that I'd like to circle back to and repost to you, which was about the cyanotypes, right? And the binding of the cyanotypes. And I just want to know about that process, because it's almost like the binding that happened as a grid was kind of necessary for the idea of the mapping of the histories of displacement, right? So I kind of want to pose to you, would you do that differently if you had the resources or the larger, mural print space and space to like make it all a larger piece? Do you think it would be different? Would you do it differently?
I don't think so, because I think like I said, I learned something from that, and I don't like slick work. And it's like I'm working on some cyanotypes now, and initially I was asked, can you make them like 60 by 80?
Yeah.
And I was like, why? Why does it need to be that big? It's not easy to work in a large format like that. And I think sometimes you have to understand the limitations of your material.
Yeah.
So I think that, I know the grid doesn't bother me so much. I didn't really think of it as mapping. So it's really interesting that you think about it that way. And now I'm like, oh yeah, I totally see it. Latitude, longitude.
That's what I thought the intent. Yeah, that's why it's so
but
I love that.
I mean, sometimes it's just not intentional. Like,
Yeah.
oh, I it's like an observation that someone points out. I'm like, oh, yeah, I did think about that, but no, it was not a plan.
Thank you for holding me there.
Yeah, I just think it just worked out that way. But I mean, it served its purpose. I think I like the way that it came out. I like that that every single cell is different. Yeah. I like that it's not smooth, that every sheet of paper, because they're 22 by 30 watercolor sheets, they buckle very differently, depending on the circumstances of the day. And that's not something that I can reproduce. Yeah. So I like that. I used to write the time that I printed it on the back of it so that I could keep, I would keep notes on exposure time. Like, okay, it's June 1st, and I put this in the sun for 2 minutes. I printed something today. It's January 14th. Yeah. That same scale, it took me 6 minutes to print it because the sun just functions differently at this time of the year, even though I'm in Southern California, which is like the best place to be able to do this work. But I'm able to keep time in that way. And I'm able to it helps me work better in the sense of I know what to predict at at any moment when I need to print. So
Yeah.
it's like me learning. Oh God, I just spilled water everywhere. Yeah.
Yeah. It kind of goes back into context about you talking about architecture, right? And the blueprint of the mapping. So
Yeah.
Yeah. I have a question here from Michael Hawley in the Q&A. So I'll pose it to you, though I know that you're getting the water up now.
I'm good. I'm so clumsy.
It's all good. We're here for it. So I'll just read it as it's like a longer comment, but it's a good one. I love the line at the end of the poem, "Sit, feast on your life." I'm very moved by your work. You look so closely, remember and make wonderful connections to your life and history. Thank you. I have a small technical question. Could you speak for a moment about the fish and the coral images in the cyanotypes? Are they collages and rephotographed, or are they underwater photos?
No, so I love the internet. I'm on the internet all the time, and I get most of my images from the internet and just sort of repurpose them for my own needs. A lot of the collages that I make are from images that I found on the internet, like plants, or I'll go photograph them myself. But yeah, they're all images that I've found online, and I just sort of snatch them up and then go and like alter them in Photoshop.
Which
nothing magical or special. I do have dreams of going underwater, like scuba diving and filming something. But yeah, I don't have that. I haven't had that chance yet. Goals, like future goals.
Yeah.
As soon as I win that MacArthur, it's on.
Yeah, but it also plays conceptually into it, though. You know, the idea of the source and the source material, right? And you're sourcing it from the internet, the history of that placement. We have another comment here from Virginia Heckert. She said, you drew the photos for your collages from ethnographic postcards. What about the photos? Oh, that was just answered in our last question. Do you take them or appropriate them from another source? Yes, that was already answered. And then one last thing I want to pose to you, because we're going on 4:03 here, and thank you to everyone that's stayed in and stuck with us through this part. I just want to know about your emotional connection to materiality, right? So you talked about the sun and indexing the time and how that affects your process, of course. But the idea of materiality as far as how it's informed by shape, how it's shifted in space and site specific, you talked a lot about that. And I just want to know your emotional connection to material, the idea of being material. You know?
I mean, I think I just really enjoy I enjoy taking something and seeing how far I can go with it, like taking something that is not, typically an art material, which is, debatable now because everybody's working in all kinds of formats, and seeing what I can do with it, and like responding to it in a way. And again, a lot of it is giving up control and giving it a life. I think that a lot of the materials that I use, like sugar, for example, have been so controlled by human beings. Like I want it to like live on its own and do what it's going to do because I've tried to control it. Like one of the things initially when I tried to cast sugar, I was like, I can't get it to not melt. Like, do I encapsulate it in resin? And it's just like, I remember I set this like resin bomb off in my backyard, and it's just like, you can't do that. Like you have to accept it for what it is and work with it. And I think that's sort of like a metaphor for a lot of larger things in life. So I let it tell me what it wants to do and then work with it. Because I can't predict it, and sometimes things happen that I can't plan for, and it ends up being incredibly beautiful. And I just kind of go with it, and I'm constantly always learning from the failures and the mess ups that I do, which is, it helps me. I say this all the time. Every time I learn how to make something, I want to learn how to destroy it.
Right.
Because that in between of creating and destroying is so fascinating, and there's so much range in that it's like endless possibilities. And I will never master any of these materials. I will never master cyanotypes. It's not a constant, it evolves just like culture does, the way people do, the way the universe does. You can't control it. Yeah. And I like that because it's constantly teaching me something.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Wonderful, thoughtful presentation and conversation. We're going on 4:06 here, so I think that we're good as far as.
If anyone has a question, my child is not here, so.
You're like, I'm good.
I'm good. So if anyone wants to ask, knock yourself out.
If there are any final questions, please do post them now. We have some good comments in the chat that are coming through. People are more so commenting and thanking you, commenting on thoughts that they had during your presentation. But one thing that I could ask you, thank you everyone that's still here, but this is one more question that I had. You had mentioned in a recent article that you wrote, the idea that what connected you to the artist or the piece in the exhibition that you were talking about was the idea of it being unfamiliar, right? And then you had also mentioned the familial. And I just want to know if you've ever posed those two as a dichotomy in your process, right? The familiar.
I know you're talking about Magda.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm wrestling with that now with the project that I'm working on for Kohler. I think with Magda in particular, I think realizing that I wasn't the only person with this particular story, because in some ways you're made to feel like a circus freak. Like, how did you get your last name? And it's just like, it's not as unfamiliar as you think it is. It's just not known to you. But not realizing that, until I was much older, but like not realizing that other countries shared the same migration story. Like I remember when I did have my Fulbright and I went to Mauritius, I found out that the Chinese population that were there were the same as my grandfather, which was like, I was like, oh my God, this is amazing, because he didn't share anything with me. He didn't share anything with us. He didn't share the language. He didn't share how to cook things, like nothing. He told us nothing about his upbringing. He was 17 when he ended up in Jamaica and lost contact with his family. So I was friends with someone, and we're still friends. He's actually in LA now, which is kind of funny. He was Chinese Mauritian, and his whole family like taught me all these things that I didn't know. And it was like finding a piece of my family and being able to find some kind of connection to it that I would have never had access to. And there's another woman that we've been collaborating of late. Her name's Tao Goff. She's an amazing professor at Cornell. She's also Chinese Jamaican. She has been informing me of things about my Hakka culture that I didn't know. And I'm like, she's like, I don't know where to get Scotch bonnets. And I'm like, girl, have you gone to any of the Puerto Rican grocery stores in New York to go get those? Like, you could totally get them. So it's like, we're constantly informing things of each other. We teach each other different things, food wise. And it's not just food, but it's just like within that food, there's a larger story. And I think we're so connected to food because of that. So I guess, I don't know if that's answered the question completely, but yeah.
Thoroughly. I just want to know your personal connection to those ideas. Like, when I read that, I was like, yes, this is it. That's the point here.
I think all the work, it's personal. Like I can't divest myself from the work. It's just who I am.
That's right. Exactly. Well, again, thank you, Andrea.
Thank you for having me.